Well, thanks very much. So, the Green Grid's a vendor and user-based organisation based on membership and concentrates on resource efficiency of originally data centres only, but you'll see as we go through the presentation, has actually expanded out into the wider world of IT and even interfaces now with governments. So I'm going to talk to you about the things that you could get involved in if you're members, and if you're not members, the things you can actually get off the website, quite a lot. So we'll proceed. And yes, as far as the Green Grid is concerned, yesterday was PUE. The Green Grid innovated PUE originally, they refined it in version 2, and now PUE has found its way into an ISO standard. So I sit on the ISO standard for resource efficient data centres, KPIs, and the first one published is out for public comment now in your national bodies, so your national standards bodies will have a copy of it out for comment, and PUE is the first one that's been standardised with ISO. So standards are coming, metrics are coming, and as you will go through the presentation, you'll see that some of the other metrics that the Green Grid started on a long time ago and have continued with are all being adopted in that ISO standard. So I'll show you those as we go forward. There's a bit of history there you can see at the Green Grid. I'm not going to go through it. It's relatively boring. So trends. Trends are accelerating. We've seen a lot today about acceleration of trends, especially data, and I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to give you some examples, I think, which are based more on facts rather than conjecture. So the trends that are accelerating shown here are certainly the web itself, data, connectivity. Trends on greenness are slowly accelerating. Lots of talk about green. There's very little action on green in some places. In the UK, people are only green if it's cheaper. Businesses only put their hand in their pocket for green technology if it saves them money. That's going to last for a long time in a lot of societies because businesses have their stakeholders and their shareholders, and they don't look at green first. You have a huge advantage up here in that you're green by default. In the UK's terms, that's because you export, Norway exports all of the gas to the UK, and so we burn the gas and emit the carbon, and you have a 100% renewable grid in Norway and Sweden and Finland together. So that's the second thing, the trend is accelerating. The last thing is government regulations. Government regulations are definitely coming. In the EU, they're certainly coming, and I've got some slides talking about why the EU is thinking of regulating data centre power. So there aren't any European standards yet, but they're coming. EN 5600 is an infrastructure standard for data centres, and a lot of the Green Grid members sit on the national bodies that are writing that standard. ISO metrics I've already mentioned are coming. They're nearly all based on Green Grid work. So PUE, first of all, is version 2 of the Green Grid's work. It's actually quite difficult to turn an informative document like PUE into a standard. Standard language is very sterile, and you have to be very careful with it. But it's nearly all based on TGG work. WUE is coming, water usage effectiveness. The Green Grid is still working on that. Carbon. So carbon usage, renewable energy factor is coming. That's also within the Green Grid, and there's several others which we can talk about as we go through. As far as Scandinavia is concerned, there's a big impact from ASHRAE. ASHRAE TC 9.9, it's certainly not a standard, it's a guideline, but it's the only guideline in the world that describes the thermal and conditions for ICT hardware, temperature and humidity conditions. And to a certain extent, my advice to everyone in Scandinavia is you better start thinking about more features other than it's a cold climate, because being a cold climate doesn't cut the mustard anymore. It doesn't give you any more competitive advantage than building a data centre in southern Spain or central Italy, or even amongst the North African coast. If you apply ASHRAE TC 9.9 thermal guidelines, especially if you go from the recommended into the allowable, you can build a data center anywhere in Europe with the same 100% free cooling and no compressors. So my advice to anyone in Scandinavia is it's a good thing to talk about, but don't hang your hat on it because time's passed for that to be a real unique selling point. There is an American standard, TIA 942-A. It's very American-centric. You can apply much of it to a data center in Europe, but some of it just doesn't apply. We have different earthing standards, different engineering standards, etc. The original TIA 942 was heavily based on the Uptime Institute papers, the original papers. So it said in the first page of TIA 942, with grateful thanks to and acknowledgement of, well, they've fallen out. Thieves always fall out. You have to buy TIA 942 and you have to pay for advice from the Uptime Institute. The original agreement with the Uptime Institute was that TIA would not ever go into accreditation of data centers, and they have in certain parts of the world. And TUI, Uptime Institute, wrote them a letter and said, that's it, you've breached the long-term agreement and you've got to remove all reference to the tier classification in your standard. So TIA 942-A was last published in March of this year, and when you open it you find no mention of the Uptime Institute at all. They took out the word tier, but left the Roman numerals. So if you want a little aside for you, if you ever write tier with a Roman numeral and you publish it, don't be surprised to get a nasty little letter from the Uptime Institute telling you you're infringing their copyright, because you have to use Roman numerals, Arabic numbers, not Roman numerals, if you talk about tiers. So TIA went halfway. They removed the word tier but left the Roman numerals. So I'm sure there'd be some more sparks to fly. But basically, the TIA and BICSI and the Uptime Institute and the EN standard are all based on the classic 4 tiers, 4 availability classes. And it doesn't take long with a piece of paper and a pencil to show that there can only ever be 4. Well, that's not the purpose of this presentation, so we'll leave that there. Then there's plenty of best practice and design guides. There's the Uptime Institute, which kind of withdrawn all their white papers and now sell the idea of operational sustainability, and the tiers are reduced to, I think, rather cleverly reduced to the idea of concurrent maintenance and fault tolerance. So you can't effectively, you can use the old white papers, but you can't use it and publish it unless the Uptime Institute give you the certification. And they certify now 3 different things: design, build, just in case you don't build what you got approval for, and then operational sustainability. So you can get 3 certificates for your wall in your entrance hall of your data center. It's interesting to look at where people are accrediting data centers. Someone earlier on today said that 45% of all the data centers in Europe were in London and the southeast of England. That's true, and I think there's only 2 accredited data centres by the Uptime Institute, because people in the UK don't want to advertise their data centres and don't see any need for a certificate. It's quite interesting. You move out to the Middle East or the Eastern Europe, and everybody wants a certificate because they think it's a selling feature of their facility. That's an interesting human reaction to a measure of goodness. There is a design standard in BICSI. It's quite North American centric as well, but you can follow it. BICSI actually does have 5 tiers. They call them classes. They have a 0. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, but they do have a 0. The 0 describes a data center without a power supply, a protected power supply, so no UPS, no generator, and no dedicated earthing system. Well, forget the earthing system for a moment, because that's also a rather American thing. But a data center without a UPS and without a generator isn't really a data center. So they've reverted to 4 as well. You can follow the EU Code of Conduct. It's a good live document for energy efficiency or energy effectiveness in data centres, and that's been used all around the world. So in Singapore, they based a document on that. In Australia, the Neighbours Programme is based on the EU Code of Conduct, and it's gaining traction, oddly enough, in China. The funny thing is, although everyone in Europe uses it, very few people sign up for it to be a participant, because it's just a bureaucratic thing. You have to give your energy figures every year, and some people just don't want to let that secret out of the box, so very few people sign up. So one of the problems we've got coming up in the future is that the EU, the DG Connect department of the EU, wants to regulate against data centre power, but don't actually recognise the EU Code of Conduct themselves, because A, they've never heard of it, and B, they say it's a failure because not enough people have signed up for it. There's about 250 data centres in Europe which are participants, and a lot of people who are endorsers, but it is a good document if you want a general read on energy efficiency. And then you've got the Green Grid's own data centre maturity model, which we'll talk about as we go through, but that's being developed further by the Green Grid, and gives you a good measure of where you are on the development roadmap towards a resource-efficient data centre. And then there's lots of certifications, apart from the Uptime Institutes themselves. There's CEDA, there's one from the Data Centre Alliance. Again, not many people want their facilities certified. So, why are we interested in resource-efficient data centres? And you've seen versions of this curve all day. The only difference is this is a real one. This is the Amsterdam International Exchange. You can get the data from their website. You won't find the curve, you have to draw the curve yourself. But what's really interesting about it is it's not Dutch traffic, it's the International Exchange, and it's got monthly data, input and output, for 14 years, the last 14 years. And it's published every month, about 1 month in arrears. I took this until January. I'll tell you why in a second. I'd stopped at January. I'll redo it again at Christmas, but I'll tell you why. But from 2001, you can see the input, and you can see it went from 2001, 690 terabytes per month to 578,000 terabytes per month, which is about 1 gigabit per second, if you work it out. Gives you some idea of the bandwidth going into a major internet exchange. And over those 14 years, that's an 840 times growth. It's about an 80% CAGR. And if you look, it's actually not stopping. Is there a laser on this thing? I don't know. Yes, there is. Good. There is a really interesting feature which I keep trying to encourage some of my students at Leeds University to do a PhD thesis on, and that's this step function. It's actually really interesting that every year goes up a lot at the beginning of the year, first 6 months, and then flattens out, and then after Christmas starts to go up again. And it's been doing it for 3, 4, 5 years. It's really interesting. The other interesting thing is you can see even the flat part has started to accelerate. Now I can explain to you why I didn't add the middle of the year. Here we are in September. It's because if I added June, it looks as if it's levelling out. If I wait till Christmas, you'll see that it's up here somewhere, because it is still growing exponentially. And it's coming from, dominated by mobile phones and video. A really interesting thing was said this morning by the opening speaker, the keynote speaker, Mr. Richard. He said, we've only got 24 hours in the day and we've only got 2 eyes. That's a really interesting point when you start to think about the Internet of Things, the billions of sensors, those billions of sensors which are coming as an avalanche, really, only issue tiny packets of data, but the thing is there's no limitation to the number. We have a limitation. There's only 2 billion internet users in the world, and we can only watch video for 24 hours a day. It's a natural limit to the size of the data growth. Now, we've got 6 billion other people that want an internet connection, and when those other 6 billion get an internet connection, you can imagine what's going to happen to this curve. So, does this matter? Well, I drew a curve that showed us what's happened over the same 14-year period with the capacity of IT. So I've assumed, and this is a very broad assumption which you can shoot me for, that's no problem at all. I've assumed that this is representative processing requirement, not just I/O, not just comms, but actually this is data generation needing to be taken in, held or worked on, and then sent back out again, because this is only half the picture. So I went back to 14 years and I said, well, back in 2001, let's take the number 1 as being our compute capacity per kilowatt hour of consumption, of computation, so 100%. And then I took things like Moore's law, originally written to double the number of transistors on another number of transistors on a chip every 24 months, modified a bit later by the clock rate. Intel put that down to every 18 months. I ignored the software impact. If you're interested in that sort of thing, read an American futurologist by the name of Raymond Kurzweil, a book called The Singularity is Near. A really good read if you're into that thing. He is horribly optimistic. He does tend to think that because we've always solved our problems in the past, we'll always solve our problems in the future. So he has huge faith in human nature. It may or may not be justified. I sort of said that back in 2001, the average PUE was about 3. I mean, we didn't call it that then, but it was probably about right. And I've assumed that we're heading towards an average of 1.4. That's optimistic. The average in the EU Code of Conduct at the moment is participants is 1.79. So there's 250 big data centers out there. They're the ones that are prepared to admit what their PUE is. Low PUEs like Google and Facebook's spoil it for the rest of us, because not everyone else can fill their data center up on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, and most people suffer from the disease of partial load. So real PUEs are still up above the 1.6, 1.7. But for the purposes of this, I've been super optimistic and said the average is 1.4 in 2014. I've taken virtualization from 0 to 40%. Back in 2001, only mainframes were virtualized, and there was no real virtualization going on. And 40% is a bit optimistic now for everybody. Clearly, there are HPC, high performance computing applications, that have got virtualization and utilization up to 90% plus, but they are in the minority. They're certainly not in the sort of co-location markets. And then utilization, and this is where I've taken a huge gamble, leap of faith. I've taken utilization of the hardware from 5% in 2001 to 40% now, and it's nowhere near 40%, it's nearer 10 as a global average. So I've been very optimistic. But if you do the curve, you find out you get 1,250 times increase in capacity. Now, before we compare the two, just think of what that means. In 14 years, it means that in 2001, if we built a 5,000 cabinet, 5 megawatt data center, 1 kilowatt per cabinet, say, the same computing capacity can now be carried out by less than 1 cabinet. That gives you an idea of where the technology's gone, and that's one thing that the governments, especially the EU, aren't prepared to consider. They think the data center industry is a power-hungry, greedy, rapacious, dirty industry, and they ignore the fact that we've done things like turn 5 megawatts into 5 kilowatts in 14 years. The problem, of course, is that the demand has always outstripped the capacity increase. So here we've got 840 times. Now, this says 1,250 times, but don't forget, we haven't refreshed all the world's hardware today. So the average age of hardware is back at, let's say, 3 years, 4 years. If you go to governments, it's more like 6 or 7 years. But and you go to Facebook, and it's 9 months. And they're using this curve to slow down the rate at which they need to build data centers by refreshing their hardware increasingly often. So if you take this curve back 3 years, you get to this 630. And with this fairly short back of the cigarette packet type of analysis, you go back one slide, you can see that the delta is that the demand's gone up by over 800 times and is exponentially increasing at the rate of more than 60% compound annual growth rate. And the capacity is trailing behind at around about 600 times, but also exponentially reducing, but at a CAGR, a compound annual growth, reduction rate of about 50%. So that explains data center growth. You can actually just say that's why data centers are becoming bigger and more power hungry, is because demand has continued to outstrip capacity, and probably will continue to do so. If you think that 2/3 of the world doesn't have an internet connection yet and wants one, you can see where the demand's going. So here we are in a situation where data centers are getting bigger and more often. We're driving it as users. At the moment, we're driving it based on a lot on social networking and video, HD video and entertainment, and TV on demand, and 4K is going to make that worse, etc., etc. So the result is about 20% power growth. During the recession, I think we've been catching up with excess capacity that was sold before. I don't know whether I've bothered to keep Jevons paradox in here. Oh yes, I probably have. So I'm going to talk about Jevons paradox. If no one's heard of Mr. Jevons, was a Victorian that predicted something that applies to us entirely at the moment. But there's definitely this unassailable link between exponential data growth and growth in power, despite best efforts of the industry. So I think we're doing our best, but some government, especially the EU, does not think we're doing our best. We think we're profligate with power. And the benefits so far, the benefits of IT, and there are some. You think of video conferencing. We shouldn't be here. You should all be sitting at home, and so should I, and we should be doing this on the internet. That's the point. So the benefits of video conferencing are a low carbon enabler. Not driving to the shopping mall with 1,000 cars on a Saturday morning, but ordering it on the internet and having it all delivered by a single diesel truck going around is a low carbon enabler. But all of those good things, and there's lots of them, we don't do many of them, but there's lots of them, are being swamped by social networking. So who's heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Come on, I know we've been repeatedly told this is Helsinki. If you haven't heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the guy from IBM has, so that's really good. He was a psychologist that said if you want to reach your full potential, your innovative, creative self, then you have to work up through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You start with sex, food, water, shelter, warmth, and somewhere to go to the toilet. And once you get those basic things, then you go up and you go safety and security and belonging, got to have someone love you, self-esteem, think good of yourself, and then finally you can reach the nirvana of self-creation. Well, there's a new version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs because it's Wi-Fi. And if you watch people when they first go into a building, you can see that really is true. Whenever people walk into a building now, the first thing they do is get out their phone and see if they've got a Wi-Fi connection. And how many times you see people during a meeting check their email? The young think it's just a God-given right. Us old people just think it's rather convenient. It's like living in the future. So the green grid's bridging the gap. We're trying to bridge the gap between consumption of resources and this tidal wave of IT and its ecosystem. With metrics about power, about carbon, about water, renewable energy use, etc., etc., including models and best practices, and including engagement with government. Admittedly, at the moment, that's far too American-centric. We are heavily engaged in the green grid with the American government and the Department of Energy on trying to make sure that people understand what is going on in the data center world. So, the Global Authority on Resource Efficient Information Technology. And the rest of this presentation is just going to flick through. We've carried up the interesting bit. I've probably got a few minutes. I'll tell you who Jevons was. William Stanley Jevons was a Victorian economist living in England. In the 1850s, Manchester was the centre of the cotton industry of the world. It was bringing in cotton, sending out cotton goods. They cut down every tree within 100 miles, burning it in Newcomen steam engines, driving the mills. The water from the hills wasn't enough. They had to steam drive. And even in Parliament, there was a debate called the coal question. That Cottonopolis, as Manchester was called then, was consuming all of the fuel of the country. All the open cast mines were being depleted, and it was debated in Parliament. And along came James Watt with his condensing boiler. And James Watt's boiler was 3 times more efficient than Newcomen's engine, and everyone had breathed a sigh of relief and said, the coal question's solved, we're not going to burn all our coal anymore. William Stanley Jevons wrote a book called The Coal Question in 1865, said, no, the very contrary is the truth. The increased efficiency of the use of fuel will only drive consumption up. And he was proved right, and he's been proved right ever since. It's now called the rebound effect. And oil companies around the world use it for predicting oil demand. The same applies exactly to data. If you give people increasing bandwidth and increasing access at ever lower costs and unlimited bundles, don't be surprised that they use them. And they don't necessarily use them for what you think they're going to use them for either. So William Stanley Jevons is a bit of a star. We've got a balanced mix of 200 member companies. You have to join the Green Grid as a member company. There's also individual memberships, very good value for money, but I didn't tell you that. It doesn't cost very much to be an individual member, but it costs quite a lot to be a member company. But it includes IT vendors, facility vendors, end users, and others. One thing, when I was an individual member, before I became the CTO of Emerson and found myself involved with the Green Grid yet again, I found access to information from the members that I had never dreamed I could get hold of before. Access to information about future roadmaps for IT equipment, etc., etc. It's an extremely open and communicative group. There are 40 interest groups in Green Grid, so when you remember, you can join as many or as few as you like. In your specialist subject, so there's ones on IT, there's ones on utilisation, there's ones on metrics, there's ones on productivity metrics for IT, water, power, carbon, all sorts, anything you like. And if you're a contributing member, you can start an interest group of your own, and you'll find 40 or 50 people who join, and you'll learn more than you ever did before, that's for certain. I certainly did. So lots of white papers. Many of these are published on the website, and you can download them for free. You get them as non-members some 6 or 9 months after they're first published. So if you like old news, you can be cheap and don't join. But if you want the most up-to-date news, and don't forget how fast our industry's moving, you really need to be at the forefront of it. But detailed reports and case studies, online tools, sorry, go back one. Online tools, the cooling maps, free cooling maps, the maturity model, webcasts, all sorts. The maturity model is a subject all by itself, but it's basically got these 2 halves to it, the facility and the IT itself. So you're looking at both the M&E infrastructure and the IT infrastructure, and you grade yourself as to where you are, and it gives you a clue as to where you should be heading. The cooling map of the world, free cooling map of the world, is really good. This one is the depressing one for you, is the cooling map of Europe used to be contoured like a weather map, and the dark blue was only when you got to Scandinavia. Now the dark blue goes all the way to Africa. So that's what ASHRAE thermal guidelines for IT equipment has done for us. And if anyone says to you, I can't apply ASHRAE 2011 TC 9.9 because I have legacy hardware, read the book. Read the book, because you'll find out that the recommended figures include all hardware ever made. In fact, I suggest you read the book anyway, because it's 46 pages. Most people only look at the one table of temperature and humidity limits. There's one for Japan and one for the States as well, obviously. And then lots and lots of case studies, energy efficiency in Japan, data center efficiency, energy policy research in EMEA, PUE, a comprehensive analysis of how the misuse of PUE. Several people today said what their PUE was in public. They should be ashamed of themselves. You're not meant to use it like that. It's meant to be a self-metric for your own self-improvement, not publicised. Life cycle assessment, big thing going on in life cycle assessments in the Green Grid for reuse and recycling of waste, e-waste. Looking at ASHRAE, saying if you take the highest temperatures, and now you can go up to 45 degrees C inlet temperature for a server for 150 hours a year, no trouble at all. That paper will actually highlight what impact it's got, which is a slight impact on reliability, so it's better not to do it. You can find sales arguments in all of this, depends on your spin. The updated free cooling maps, environmental guidelines in Japan, and then all of the other ones. So we've got financial and operational efficiencies, the technical ones, the private and public cloud architecture, software, IT, and the regulatory bodies. We're doing it all. Fine-tuning of business models. eBay transactions per kilowatt hour started its roots, as eBay, remember, in the green grid. So that dashboard that comes from eBay that you can look on the website, you can find out how many transactions per kilowatt hour they're currently running, and obviously the metric of efficiency of their data center is measured in that way. Convergence to site selection and sustainability, big section there that covers the Nordics in principle. You can find in those documents that you are an extremely good place to put a data center once you've got the connectivity, which you have. The maturity model, Green Grid does training. We don't actually do much of that in Europe at the moment, but I think we should. There's a version. You can have these slides later, obviously, from the website. There's a slight expansion of the facility in IT, and you can see that it's got elements of power, cooling, management, and other, and then the IT, compute, storage, network, and other. So it covers the whole cycle. I don't know what this slide actually says. I'll have to go through it with you. Oh yeah, well, software defined. Coming down to fewer servers with more output per unit of energy. That looks bad news for people like IBM. They want to sell more and more servers. The good news for IBM is the demand is going up faster than the technology can keep up with it. So in the future, the industry for data centers and what goes in them is extremely positive, unlike the paper and pulp mill, for instance, story you heard earlier on. Lower TCO, and then I'm just reaching the end of the presentation and my time, but we've got highly utilised data centres, obviously, is the target. So efficiency measurements, low power and cooling overhead, power efficient IT equipment. The really important thing is not PUE. The really important thing is the utilisation of the IT hardware. Most data centres sit there idling, burning power, even in an efficient PUE, a low PUE. It's no use if your IT equipment is doing nothing or close to nothing. Read all this later. One thing there, unused equipment turned off. A lot of people do that, and then of course they forget that they turn their servers off and ruin their airflow pattern in their data center because the air goes straight through the server that they've just spent a lot of time putting blanking plates in. Needs to be thought about. There's a fascinating word, fungible. I'll leave it to you to look it up. It's a great word. So automatically scale up and down. Obviously, a software-defined data center, both on the IT side and the DCIM side. And the designs can be made to do that. Data centers of the past used to take constant power all the time. They're increasingly now starting to vary with the workload, which was never heard of before. Standards today and tomorrow. We've got things in Europe like Lot 27 on UPS systems as an energy efficiency standard coming out. The EU Code of Conduct itself, all of the Singapore neighbours in Australia, etc. We collaborate with everyone because we can. We don't fall out with anybody. And we're heavily involved with ISO and IEC, but especially ISO, from a standards development point of view. Governments, and staying ahead of the curve on life cycle analysis, and I think we're coming to the end. So there's a lot of work going on in one of the groups in the Green Grid, waste to power. There's also another group doing it the other way around, power to waste. which I rather like. The reuse of waste heat. It's another ISO metric that's coming that was started in the Green Grid. So the idea of not just burning electricity, making sure it's renewable, but actually then reusing that heat for whatever you can. And of course, the bigger the data centre, the harder that is to do. Two sides of green IT are converging. You get the picture. You've heard about it all before. And then environmental policies with component reuse and recycling. There was a lovely case earlier on someone saying the component reuse, not enough of that goes on. Most e-waste is landfill or incinerated or sent to the undeveloped parts of the world for children to break up with hammers. That is not a criticism of the IT industry. It's a criticism of governments not actually enforcing their own regulations. So we have regulations in Europe, and yet we still end up with e-waste in the subcontinents, which is absolutely terrible. So the government should step up and enforce their e-waste recycling laws. And that's it. So I think I'm probably 5 minutes over.